This video is part 2 of the series, and in syllabus terms this is picking up on section D, religious identity through unification. So we're looking at what is in general terms referred to as the ecumenical movement, and looking at in detail the World Missionary Conference 1910 and the World Council of Churches 1948. Revisiting this diagram from the introduction video, it's essential to remember that these different strands, there's 3 of them looked at within our syllabus, these are not isolated and independent, they're all completely interlinked, and there's plenty of other factors going on at the same time. So in this video we're looking at D, this top down. So this is the church working as institution. This is when we're looking at gatherings of bishops, we're looking at the Methodist Conference, we're looking at the Baptist Union when all the senior clergy are meeting together, we're looking at, in Roman Catholic terms, at what's going on in the Vatican. We're looking at the way that the church as a body, so this would be the Church of England makes statements, or the Methodist Church makes statements, and they influence what's going on at the local churches, and so therefore at whatever it might be, St Paul's Salisbury has a local Church of England church, or Moston Methodist Church, or Brown Street Baptist Church. Those individual churches will be significantly influenced by what is coming from the top of their institution, their institutional church. But of course the institutional church is not some abstract body, it's made up of individual Christians. At the time we're looking at, they're essentially men. So these individual men who themselves are belonging to local churches and being influenced by those bottom-up elements in this diagram. And so it's this feedback cycle, it's the interrelation between these, and of course it's also to do with what is going on in the world at the time, both at world level and then right down to what's going on in local communities. We're going to focus here on the World Missionary Conference 1910 and the World Council of Churches, simply because that's what's in our syllabus, but always remember to place that in a much wider context with lots of factors all feeding in to the same direction. Much of what we're looking at here is movements developing during the 19th century, particularly the final quarter of that century. Lots of different movements internationally, lots of movements particularly within Europe, Europe's relationship with the rest of the world. And there were strands, movements culturally, which meant that people started to seriously engage with coming back together again to try and pull the church back to where it was when it started, and to start to reverse those fragmentation, the trends of fragmentation experienced from 1054 and then Reformation, and then fragmentation within Protestantism. And it's the experience of the church during the 19th century in its overseas missionary work, particularly through empires, that we're going to look at now. We'll start then with the World Missionary Conference 1910. If you're interested, you can the PDFs of this lot online, and as with most of these church conferences, there's a huge volume of material generated. These are the hard copies pictured here. masses and masses of discussion, theology, sociology, all mixing together as people are wrestling with how to apply the Christian faith in the context in which they find themselves. And the context in which they found themselves was that at the tail end of the 19th century, as empire was really beginning to be seen as an opportunity to shape the world, the church was seeing that taking Christianity to the different parts of the empire was something they ought to be doing. The missionary movement didn't start in the 19th century with empire. The missionary movement has always been a major driving force within the church, right from St. Paul and the other apostles in the first century we have recorded in the Bible. They've always been doing that. You can look through British history. You've got characters like St. Ced, who came down from Lindisfarne and landed in what we now know as Essex, missionary to the East Saxons. These characters are spread all the way throughout Christian history and throughout the world. Our focus now, though, is what happens when that gets into the 19th century with European empire. There was a fair amount of this which was just about simple practicality. When these people were out on the mission field, so if you've got missionaries working in Africa, I don't know, let's just take Uganda. So you've got the Church of England is in Uganda. Methodist Missionary Society was probably there. You probably find Baptist Missionary Society was there. You would find various others were there. And inevitably, if you're in Uganda and you've got a few Brits who are living within, well, I suspect at this stage they'd be on horseback with a horse and carriage, and so if you've got some other Brits living even 20 miles away, you would probably want to go and meet with them and talk with them. And so what they were finding was that they were sharing the same difficulties. And so they would turn up, and some of it would inevitably be just incredibly practical. How do you educate your children? Which schools are they at? How is your wife getting on? How do you cope with the hot climate? How's the language teaching going on? And so there was that very practical realization that these different churches were in it together. Back in UK with the mission headquarters, there was also a sense there of making sure that people were not just reinventing the wheel over and over again, making sure that things like translation work was not being duplicated. And so therefore, to ensure that if you're going to work with a particular people group and you need the Bible and you need hymns translated into that language, they weren't wasting effort by having each individual denomination doing its own translation work, that was something that could be shared. So a lot of this was very practically driven. They're all in it together. There's lots that can be shared. There's lots that can be understood together. And some of the denominational differences were fairly small. The difference in many ways between Anglicans and Methodists out on the mission field would be pretty minor. More different when you get to Baptists, because they want to then have adult baptism, but quite honestly the Anglicans and the Methodists would have been practicing lots of adult baptism at the time, so even that would be similar for them. Roman Catholics were very much out of the picture at this stage, and the Orthodox were not really in the picture because they didn't really have empires. The East at that stage wasn't in a particularly strong position. So these are the titles then of these books that you're highly unlikely to bother to read. Carrying the gospel to all the non-Christian world, and that's just picking up on that same missionary drive that we saw recorded in Acts, the church in the mission field, education in relation to the Christianization of national life. Building schools was a major component in the mission work. A lot of it was very, very practical, building schools, hospitals, sanitation, social change, suggesting that some of these people groups stopped eating each other, the abolition of the practice of sati in India. That was where the widow was burned on the husband's funeral pyre. So lots and lots of things which in many ways might be perceived as nothing to do with Christianity. But Christianity is actually something which pervades the whole of life, and so it was shaping all aspects. 4, then, the missionary message in relation to non-Christian religions. And again, this is something they were all having to do together. They were all having to engage with what were the religious beliefs of the people in India. It was actually Victorian anthropologists who then decided that they were going to call it Hinduism and turn it into an ism and study it in the way that other major world religions are studied. They wanted to make it studyable in the same way that Christianity was studyable. And so in many ways you could say that the Victorian anthropologists and religious studies people invented Hinduism. It didn't really exist before that. It was just simply the way that people lived in the Indian subcontinent. 5, the preparation of missionaries. Now there'd be a huge area of commonality in that, just very practical, knowing how to live in hot climates, language training, all sorts of very practical issues where it'd be worth them all sharing good practice, sharing what they knew, sharing training in some cases. Home base of missions and governments. And again, the churches would be having to liaise with governments, which would be the governments of the places that they were living in, the indigenous people's government, but possibly even more so trying to keep the right side of the British governmental levels that be negotiating with government and military to ensure that they weren't getting in the way. Cooperation and the promotion of unity. There was an awareness that it wasn't actually very good in terms of proclaiming the gospel if they found that the indigenous peoples were looking at these white Christians all indulging in destructive infighting between themselves. And then 9 then is just the history and records of the conference. So that's really tedious. That is just a recording of what they did, indexing and lists. We now move on to the World Council of Churches. We've got a date on this of 1948, but it's incredibly important all the time as we look at this desire to reunite the church, to reverse the fragmentation experienced from 1054, then Reformation, then the fragmentation within the Protestant church. It's important not to think of these as individual, specific, dateable events. Yes, there are some dates we can pin down, World Missionary Conference 1910, but that was the culmination of movements within the church over the previous certainly 30 years, maybe 50 years. World Council of Churches really followed on from that World Missionary Conference 1910. And it's important to just look at a bit of European history to ensure that we get this in context. Of course, we had the World Missionary Conference at 1910, then moved from that into the First World War, which fairly obviously disrupted unity amongst churches because the home countries were at war. Then as you come out of that, it didn't take long then before Europe started moving into the Second World War, and again that was a massive disruption. So the gap between 1910 and 1948 is rather stretched, rather artificially stretched, because you simply have to take out of it probably 10 years, maybe more, of just huge disruption of the process because of those world wars. So let's just have a run through some of those strands which ended up in 1948 becoming something which you could date and label. Through the 19th century, there were a significant number of movements, student movements, particularly people at university together as now. If you're a Christian and you turn up at university, a lot of the time denomination isn't that significant. People, as they go to university and are opened up in their thinking, living away from home, they can then be very fluid, very flexible in denominational allegiance. Those movements through the 19th century culminated then in the 1910 Edinburgh World Missionary Conference we've looked at. There's then, just looking at the East, which we tend to not look at in much detail, but in 1920 there was an encyclical from the Orthodox Synod of Constantinople, suggesting a fellowship of churches similar to the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the general movement to try and not have another war like the 1418 war that they had just come out of. And then we've got leaders, then church leaders. There were 100 churches represented in a vote in 1937-38 to found a World Council of Churches. Now, 100 churches there, that's needs to be looked at that in terms of denominations. We're not talking about just local churches there, as in, sort of St Thomas Salisbury is a local instantiation of the Church of England. But when it says churches, that's capital C churches, that's the Church of England, the Baptist Church, etc. But notice that's 1937-38, fairly obviously that then was just put on hold as the world collapsed into war. Looking then at history, this first World Council of Churches Assembly in 1948, there were 147 member churches at that. Don't forget this is denominations that we're talking about here. Current membership's about 350. Now, incredibly important, and we'll keep coming back to this, and this is a key issue as we explore the success or otherwise of the World Council of Churches, is the second point. It was predominantly Protestant and Western in its earliest years. Now the World Council of Churches developed during the 60s. It grew. Some Orthodox churches, that's the Eastern tradition, they started to join the World Council of Churches, and also these churches from the previous colonial regions. So as the European empires broke up, British Empire particularly, then you ended up with new denominations, new churches, as these newly independent countries ceased to be just simply part of their European parent bodies and became independent churches, and they joined the World Council of Churches. Second Vatican Council, so that's Vatican II as it's normally called, 62-65. Now that greatly improved relations between the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholics, but very importantly, the Roman Catholics were not and still not are members of the WCC. Let's have a look then in some more detail at the Roman. In order to understand how important it is as to whether the Roman Catholic Church is part of the World Council of Churches or not, it's worth having a look at some numbers. And so here we've got, these are the numbers of Christians in the world. That's a major problem, counting Christians. How do you define a Christian? That's not as important as the relative numbers, the proportions here. So this world Christianity, Roman Catholic then, is 1,313 million. They're not part of the World Council of Churches. Protestants then, the ones counted as Protestants, 900 million. Anglicanism, another 110 million. Anglicanism is sort of a sort of Protestantism, really. Eastern Orthodox, 270 million. Oriental Orthodox, 80 million. And then miscellaneous, 37 million. But you can see from that the absence of that huge chunk. It's not quite half, but it's going in that direction, of 1,313 million Christians are not part of the World Council of Churches. The Vatican is not willing to buy into the World Council of Churches. So it's not difficult to see somebody saying, well, you can't really call yourself a World Council of Churches if in fact the Roman Catholics aren't on board. There's still that fundamental separation there. And that plays itself out down at local level. The World Council of Churches is the world level, and then down at local level you have local councils of churches. They don't tend to be called councils of churches anymore. They tend to be churches together. So you will have churches together in Salisbury. And one of the things there you'll find is that those churches, they all do all sorts of joint activities, and so it's a fairly standard one is you have a week when churches join together. I'm from Church of England, so therefore we'll have a week when there's an announcement saying there's no service in our church, and what we're doing is we are going to, whichever one it might be, the Methodist Church, the United Reformed Church, and another week it's an announcement to say that those others are coming to us, and so there's a week when we're saying that the Methodists and the URC are joining with us in our service. And so it's fairly standard to do that once a year. There is a major problem with that, is that you can't do that with the Roman Catholics really, because Roman Catholic services are nearly always a mass, and if you go to a mass and you are not a Roman Catholic, you can't take part. The clergy can't take part because they're not really counted as ordained. And so whereas it would work the other way around, the Church of England would have absolutely no problem with these Roman Catholics turning up and taking communion. It doesn't work in reverse. And so at that local level, so right down to the very local level of our local churches in Salisbury or wherever it is that you live, there's that division still in place. It's there right up to the top level with the World Council of Churches. So that question, very fundamental one, is what do you mean World Council of Churches when the Roman Catholics are not on board? So this question of the Roman Catholic response to ecumenism, with the focus here on the World Council of Churches, is essential. They represent such a huge section of the worldwide Christian church, and they were half of the split, obviously, in the 1054 Great Schism, and then they were in the West. They were then sort of half of that split between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. So their decision to join or not join is a very significant one in this. Now, that's not to say there's been no movement. The Roman Catholic Church has moved enormously in its views over the past 50 years or so, but it is still not fully part of the World Council of Churches. So looking back to 1928, and here we've got a papal encyclical, and key element to this is the Apostolic See. That's the Roman Catholics' official statements say that the Pope and the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church, that's what they mean when they say the Apostolic See. The Apostolic See cannot on any terms take part in their assemblies, that's the World Council of Churches, nor is it in any way lawful for Catholics either to support or to work with such enterprises. For if they do so, they will be giving countenance to false Christianity, quite alien to the one Church of Christ. Now that's pretty confrontational. That's not a negotiating position. That is really saying that, it's really saying that the Protestants are a bunch of heretics who they want absolutely nothing to do with. That is the official Roman Catholic position at the Reformation, and certainly in 1928, that's pretty much a restatement of that position. Okay, we'll move on now to Vatican II, and it's probably not an understatement to say that Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church, moved in about a decade the sort of distance that the Protestants had moved in about 500 years. It really turned the Roman Catholic Church upside down. That was the point at which it shifted from Latin into English. And what's important to remember is there's no shortage of people around today, Roman Catholics. If you're from a Roman Catholic background, the older members of your family will remember Vatican II vividly. I mean, I was a Protestant, I still am a Protestant, but I remember Vatican II. I mean, Roman Catholic boys, as I was growing up, they went to church in Latin. That was what they did, and they were banned. You know, as a Roman Catholic, you couldn't set foot inside a Protestant church. And Vatican II radically changed all that, really opened up dialogue between churches. And so we've got quotes here from Vatican II. The restoration of unity among all Christians is one of the principal concerns of the Second Vatican Council. So a huge shift from that 1928 statement. The Sacred Council gladly notes all this. It has already declared its teachings on the Church, and now, moved by a desire for the restoration of unity among all the followers of Christ, it wishes to set before all Catholics the way and means by which they can too respond to this grace and to this divine call. So whereas the Vatican II was certainly not saying Protestants are okay, they're just like us, but it was a real thaw of relationships between them. And there's been every effort since then to do what we can together, rather than the previous understanding was we've got absolutely no interest in doing anything with you at all. So going back to local level, it's a standard service that these Churches Together groups will do is there's a service called Stations of the Cross, which Roman Catholics have on often on Good Friday. And it's one of the very few services in the Roman Catholic Church which is not a mass, and so therefore we can all turn up. And so it's very standard for all the clergy of a particular area to turn up and take part in those Good Friday services, because it's something that we can do together. In Salisbury there's a procession of witness, and all the clergy take part in that, and laity as well, and so that's something again that can be done. So it's a shift here from the 1928 attitude, which was saying we just want absolutely nothing at all to do with these Protestants or Orthodox, to the Vatican II model, which saying there's still barriers between us, but what we will do, we will seek out those things which we can do together and try to, we will negotiate, we'll continue talking about those things which are a problem. And that's summed up in this statement here. The Sacred Council exhorts all the Catholic faithful to recognise the signs of the times and to take an active and intelligent part in the work of ecumenism. So recognition there, sign of the times, a recognition that actually the 1960s was not the 1560s, the things had changed. And active and intelligent part of the work of ecumenism means that if you don't have to be divided on something, then you can just get on and do it together, even if it's as simple as the clergy meeting together to just drink coffee, eat biscuits, and just talk about the work that they're doing, just making friendships across those clergy divides. So huge shift in Vatican II in the 1960s. We now move on to a statement by Joseph Ratzinger. He is a Roman Catholic theologian, towering figure in Roman Catholic theology, and one of the most significant Roman Catholic theologians of, I don't know, 100 years, maybe more than that. This is a statement made in 1983, but this is pretty much the current thinking of the Roman Catholic Church. And Ratzinger's theological status was enhanced by the fact that he became Pope. So it was then not only Ratzinger as this towering genius of a theologian, but also Ratzinger the Pope. So he was Pope 2005 to 2013. He retired, which is not what popes normally do. Popes normally die. So Ratzinger then, in his piece of work here, Luther and the Unity of the Churches, very clearly there you can see that what he's doing is he's trying to build bridges to create some sort of dialogue, recovering the split from the 16th century. The Second Vatican Council specifically states that the only Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. There are also many true Christians, and much that is truly Christian outside the visible boundaries of the Church. Now that is a move, that's a significant move even from the statements in Vatican II in the 60s. But if you compare that with the statements in 1928, it's pretty close to a U-turn. And what Ratzinger's doing here is, it's a great way of working really, that he's doing some sort of theological fudging really, and he's got this word, we've got it in English, don't we? The Vatican, of course, all their theology is done in Latin. And Ratzinger's there playing with this idea, subsists in the Catholic Church. Now, a complex theological term, which I've got absolutely no interest at all in exploring now in any detail. But the important part of it is that it's a technical theological word which enables Ratzinger and the other theologians to play around, to move things, to open up possibilities for the future. We need to look then at what the World Council of Churches actually does. What is its role? How does it function? So the World Council of Churches today. These slides really are just taken off the World Council of Churches website, which is worth having a look at. And it says on there, it tells us that the World Council of Churches focuses its work in 3 programme areas. And so it's got what it calls unity, mission and ecumenical relations. It's got public witness and diaconia, and then ecumenical formation. So we need to look at what those mean in more simple English. So the first of these, which is the statement taken off the website, this is unity, mission and ecumenical relation. And it's to a certain extent, it's stating the pretty obvious as to what you'd expect the World Council of Churches to be doing, which is the pursuit of visible Christian unity. Don't forget the whole purpose of this is trying to rebuild these divisions of the Great Schism and the Reformation. So seeking a deeper understanding of one another, and that will work at numerous levels. So going back to that diagram where all of these aspects of unity are working at 3 levels. So World Council of Churches is very much sort of top-down stuff, but that then filters down to the way things work on the ground, seeking a deeper understanding of one another. And again, a return to these churches together organisations at local level. This is churches just getting alongside each other, particularly clergy. And it's fairly standard for clergy just to meet and have lunch. Let's not do anything that's going to be contentious. You just get to know each other as ministers who are in many ways doing the same jobs, and you talk about the issues in the local area. You just get to know each other, and so seeking a deeper understanding of one another. And it's trying to bring the Roman Catholics on board, and it's working with those others who again might have doubts. There's some Protestants who are not entirely sure about the World Council of Churches, And so it's there's quite plenty of evangelicals who are somewhat dubious about it because of its liberal theology, Pentecostals, but increasingly the World Council of Churches is managing to bring on board a wide range of Christians. And there's plenty of, at the local level, plenty of local churches together groups who are able to pull together pretty well the whole spectrum. The Roman Catholics will be there, the evangelicals will be there, the Pentecostals will be there. And it's a great statement of trying to work together, seeking a deeper understanding of one another, to use that WCC phrase, and trying to heal some of those divisions going back 500 years to the Reformation and 1,000 years to the Great Schism, if the Orthodox are involved. Now the other one here then is public witness and diaconia, and this is living out the Christian life in the public sphere. It's the area of the World Council of Churches which you could see as the political. It's where the World Council of Churches, as a pretty substantial body representing a lot of people in the world, is concerned with service. That's what diaconia is about: service, being a deacon, being a servant. And so it's about justice and peace. It's about getting involved in peacemaking, peace building, in areas where there's tensions. It's trying to identify those areas in the world, those areas of life which need a Christian voice, and the World Council of Churches is a pretty big player, and so it can have that voice. And so, unsurprisingly, it's involved in climate change discussions, it's involved in world economic discussions, water rights, women's issues, peace, justice, HIV and AIDS work. So it's there being a servant, being the church to the world. And the final aspect of the World Council of Churches then we're looking at is this ecumenical formation. And this is the bit which is, for those outside the church, the most tedious, really, because this is the bit which is internal. It's about the churches thrashing things out between themselves. It's about churches discussing ecumenically. It's about the World Council of Churches providing education. And there's three aspects of this, which: ecumenical continuing formation, ecumenical theological education, and the Ecumenical Institute, all of which are saying the same thing. It's about making sure that all the churches, as many different churches throughout the world, are thinking ecumenically, studying ecumenically. There's good quality theology going on, and part of that then there's the theological the Institute, which is in Switzerland, and that's a place where this ecumenical education can go on. So very much a sort of internal church thing, and not particularly interesting for those outside. It's about sitting around and talking and writing discussion papers and publishing journals about ecumenism, all of course about rebuilding those bridges that were broken at the Reformation. The Reformation, of course, was about theology and theological discussion, but that was theology which was to divide. Likewise with the Great Schism, that was when theologians were getting together to identify why they couldn't do things together and why they were different. And this aspect of the World Council of Churches, this ecumenical formation strand, is doing the exact opposite. It is theological study to show that actually there are plenty of overlaps, focusing on the overlaps, focusing on doing joint theological study rather than theology to separate. This is about ecumenical education. It's about leadership, it's about church leaders, it's about people thinking theologically, getting theological education into the churches. So there's the ecumenical continuing formation bit, which is just putting out programs for people to learn and think theologically and ecumenically. So to finish then, let's have a look at what are the major issues to reflect on as you think about the World Council of Churches. And the syllabus picks up on this, I think, very well. Because the fairly obvious one is to say, well, okay, we've got the World Council of Churches, it's been there since 1948. Has it actually achieved anything? Could you count the World Council of Churches as a success or a failure? And then the other aspect which we've touched on is this very thorny issue of how much can it call itself the World Council of Churches when in fact the Roman Catholic Church refuses to become formally part of it.